Sylvia, could you please tell us who you are first?
Sure. I'm Sylvia Orduno. I'm an organizer with Michigan Welfare Rights, and I'm also an active member of the People's Water Board Coalition.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about water security and insecurity today. What does water security mean for you?
Water security, I think it has a lot of meanings, really. There's definitely the aspect of it around how it is that we need to make sure that we've got the hydration we need just to be able to survive for our daily needs. There's also the aspects of it in terms of how it is that water security matters for our world as a society, as communities of people, and how it is that we're able to take care of ourselves and one another, and the role that water has in that, in cleansing and hygiene and just the functions of civil societies, right, or any society really. And then there are the larger issues about how it is that water plays into our natural environments and what it is that other living life needs.
So in the context of Detroit, what are some of the burning issues around water security that you see? There's a lot there.
Oh yeah, we've been working on this for too long, really. So the main thrust of what we've been doing, especially through Michigan Welfare Rights, and where like a lot of my time and energy has been, is around this struggle for water affordability based on income. So for, gosh, almost 2 decades now, we've known that in the city of Detroit, and even in a lot of communities in other parts of the state, Highland Park in particular, that many families have been struggling with water bills that are unaffordable, water bills that are just too high, whether it's because of, plumbing problems in the house, or they've just got large households, and with the ways that, there are not enough living wage jobs, or people have been having to retire from jobs because of medical conditions, lots of reasons for why people's economic stability has been challenged, that utilities have been a growing problem. The issue of water really came to a head when we started learning more about how it was that the water department was shutting people off in Highland Park and then later Detroit, and that there wasn't really any clear policy around how it was happening, because some people would get shut off for as little as $100, where others had bills in the thousands of dollars. So how is it that the determinations were being made?
So can you tell us a little bit about how the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization got involved with the struggle for water security? How does it align with the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization's own missions and goals?
Sure. So Michigan Welfare Rights is an anti-poverty organization. We're member-based, driven by the belief that there should not be any poverty. There's a world of plenty, and instead what has happened is that policies and choices have been made to say that if you do not have a job, you cannot have things that are necessary to pay for those, right? And so what we've seen over the years is that as people have lost their jobs or lost their ability to even work, disabilities, injuries, other kinds of family household issues, people have been struggling to pay their bills. And so this history that we have in this welfare rights movement has been really about women with children in particular, who have stepped forward and said, look, we have a right to survive and thrive, and the government policies that exist are making it difficult for our family to be able to manage the basics of life. And as residents of this nation, as human beings, we have a right to demand these sorts of things for survival. And so in the 60s, the movement was really about pushing on the federal government to provide these basic necessities through some of the older welfare programs. As we sort of fast forward in when President Clinton was in and he was pushing for welfare reform, one of the things that we were really concerned with was that there was going to be a huge problem with people being able to meet their basic needs, because now they were talking about time limits, right? That a family was only going to be able to get assistance for, utilities, housing, food, other things for a certain amount of time. The cash assistance was going to be also tied to whether or not you were participating in workforce programs. But then just the whole premise of it was never really set up for success, right? So there were never really any living wage jobs that were promised as part of the program participation. There wasn't the other kind of support systems in place around how it is that you make sure the kids have the proper education, child care support, medical care, all these other things that people need, transportation to get to jobs. Instead, what they just had is people running around. So there's a lot of wasted time for the most part. And we ran programs here trying to demonstrate that it's just a waste of time. And so over the years, what we've ended up seeing is that the time limits actually resulted in some real consequences. So if you're only going to get cash assistance to be able to pay your bills, knowing that, again, a lot of times those jobs were not going to work out. Low income jobs are often, low kinds of low wage service work, things where you're not highly skilled, where you need an education to be able to earn more money. But the education monies were cut back too. That wasn't something they were going to allow people on public assistance to do, get a college degree, to actually really benefit and improve your situation. We just ended up seeing a lot of people struggling with just being able to keep the roof over their families' heads and utilities. Meanwhile, the federal government is getting out of public housing the way that it's done. They went to this mixed income unit housing. And in the city of Detroit, what we ended up seeing too was that the mortgage foreclosures and the tax foreclosures resulted in a lot of people losing their homes. So while we're talking about homelessness and how it is we're going to address it, more homelessness is being created because people are being pushed out of their homes. And for some of those households, they were pushed out because they could not keep up with utilities on top of the rent or the mortgage payments. People were losing their jobs. Again, if you can't pay your mortgage, you can't pay your rent, you can't have housing. That's the way that we work here in the United States. And even additionally so, your utilities. You can't pay for it, you can't have it. So what we were trying to do, especially early on, when we were getting more into understanding what this was looking like, a lot of our early work actually was with the electric and gas utilities. And what we saw were problems with people who were, burning up in house fires. People were desperate to keep, warm. It's cold here in the north, right, in Michigan. And so we have people who have to stay warm in these old brick houses, and and the cold stays in. And so they're plugging in lots of electric heaters and power strips, and you got old wires in homes, and something always goes wrong. Sometimes people bring in kerosene heaters, and fires were happening. And in those years, in the early 2000s, we're out in front of the utility company, and we're protesting, and we're saying, look, these deaths are on your hands. You've got to do something about it. And it's in these same years when we're learning more about the growing problems with water. People are calling us and saying, you know what, my water's shut off, or my basement is backed up, and I don't know what to do. There's raw sewage, and I don't understand why this is happening. It's coming from the street. It's coming from everywhere, and we've got these rains and the snow melting, all these problems that we're trying to get a grasp on. The water situation, though, for us, many ways kind of had its founding in Highland Park, because Highland Park was also the place where the first emergency manager was taking place. Highland Park is also the only other community where they've got their own public water department, or their own water department that belongs to the city. And so it's this valuable asset, but it also was something that the residents didn't have to rely upon Detroit for. They could operate and manage their own water department, and you would get your bills from that local system. But then over years, as corporations also left Highland Park and moved out to the suburbs, the residents that are there, a lot of them older, are left with these assets that need repair, infrastructure that's old and needs to be upgraded, and a lot of just inefficiency with city operations. At one point, for instance, the city had no fire and police departments, and they ended up having to contract with the county because they couldn't afford to pay, these municipal workers. And so things were so streamlined, and there was a lot of insecurity around how it was that, people's water was, being delivered for one. Like people weren't sure about how safe the water plant was. But then as we started to learn more, we were doing door-to-door visits with residents where we started hearing the stories of people who were saying, you know what, I don't have water, but I don't really want to talk about it publicly. Or we would have residents who would come to some meetings that we were organizing with this newly formed Highland Park Human Rights Coalition, and folks there would tell us stories. But again, like a lot of times people don't want to be public about their stories. There's shame, there's fear, there's embarrassment, and there's this feeling that this is really my personal problem, rather than it's something that other people are experiencing or that other people can understand about how it is that these problems are coming about to begin with, right? So in that experience of doing a lot of the door-to-door work, that's when we started meeting more of the residents. And a lot of times they wouldn't even open the door more than just like a little bit, just a little bit, just, kind of find out like, why are you coming to my house? Why are you asking these kinds of questions? But more and more, we started learning how there are seniors in homes without water. I remember there was one woman who came home from the hospital, but she didn't have water. And the doctors actually weren't going to release her at home because they said, well, you need water to be able to still manage, your care, your after hospital care. And so I think, if I remember right, I think she told him that she'd gotten the water turned back on, even though she didn't, because she couldn't afford to also stay in the hospital, right? You start getting these other bills that you've got to be responsible for. Another woman, I remember, told us that she didn't have water on, but her high school children needed to be able to bathe in the morning. And so they would go over to an auntie's house and they would go shower over there before they came to school. So, these kinds of stories. Then other ones that were more sort of like fear-based, where we would have residents say like, I don't know what's going on, but I hear the water spigot on the side of my house getting turned on. And I know somebody's out there stealing my water, but I'm afraid to look. I don't know who it is, why they're doing this. So you start hearing more about how people are doing some desperate things because they don't have water on at their homes. When we started, again, like learning more about the situations in Detroit, a lot of them were very similar. We'd go visit residents who were calling here and saying, hey, I don't have water, or I'm about to get shut off. I don't know what to do. I don't have money. They're asking me for $5,000. I don't have $5,000. And, we're trying to understand, like, why is the bill so high this way to begin with? How can anybody's bill get to be that high? And then we thought later, well, this must be a mistake. We need to start looking into these things. We're asking questions of the water department, and we're saying, hey, we're getting people calling here, and they want to understand their water bills, and we really don't understand ourselves, like how the bill is so high. Come to find there's just all kinds of problems going on. So they're anywhere from like old computer systems to not enough staff to people who say they never got the bills, to people who avoided the bills, to just lots of problems with just being able to get accurate information for one, but then people who have had long-standing issues been able to pay the bills. So maybe they've been paying just a tiny bit over time because that's all they could afford, and the bills just accumulate, and the water department let them accumulate. I think the highest bill I ever saw here, and I couldn't even believe myself, was like $29,000. And I never understood like how a bill could get that high. How does anyone even, ever come to determine like, we're going to keep letting this bill go, and then when it's that high, thinking that there's any way anyone could pay that bill, right? At that point, you might as well just say, that's a loss. There's no way anyone's going to ever be able to do that. But it's like these kinds of conversations that we really haven't been able to get at the heart of, in terms of like trying to understand how is it that like a system can go so awry in terms of its own responsibility for making sure that people are billed properly, but how is it also that this basic need that we all have of water can end up costing so much in really what is a short amount of time. I don't think we've really understood the complexity of the issue enough, but we've had a lot of people that are quick to respond with the blaming, and that's been part of the frustration in trying to like argue against this issue of why affordability matters, why this human right to water matters, and how it is that we've really got to have a different framework and how it is we talk about it.
Tell us a little bit about how you engage or reach out some of these different actors, both organizations and agencies like DWSD on the one hand, as well as community partners. So maybe begin with, so there are all these hosts of issues: accumulating water bills, lack of paperwork, follow-up, water infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
What has been the result so far of your trying to engage the powers that be on these issues?
So for us, it started with the very issue of trying to understand the individual household situation. So we'll get folks that come in or call and say, look, my bill is this amount, and they're asking me for some portion of it to be able to either keep the water on or to get it restored, and they don't have it. And so we call the water department. So that's one of the first things we do, is we call the water department and we say, hey, we've got this member, and they've been saying, or this resident, they've got this water bill that they're about to get shut off, and they don't have the money, and we need to keep the water on. So at least in the earlier years, it used to be that we were just trying to figure out, like, what is the process? Because there wasn't really a clear process about what you do in those situations. And we would find some case manager in the water department, and he would, take our calls, or we would send emails. We'd manage to get his email or his fax number, and, like we love to fax here. And so we'd fax people and say, look, you got to do something about this. You can't shut out this family. They've got kids in the house, and so we've got to find a way to keep the water on. So a lot of times we'd be able to get something worked out, but the problem is that it's oftentimes going to be temporary, because they'll say, all right, we'll accept the $50 that this person has, even though we want $100 in order to keep the water from being shut off. But then they're going to have to get in a payment plan that's going to be $125, and that doesn't make sense, because we just finished telling you that their income is only $600 a month, their rent is $550, and so there's almost no money for anything else. So how does that make sense? They're like, well, this is what we need because the bill is so big, but again, how did the bill get to be so big, right? And so it becomes this almost like no-win situation. So what happens is a lot of people will just agree to whatever it is that the water department is saying, because they're desperate to get their water on or to keep it from getting shut off. So that's been kind of like the history of it, even over these years. Even now, we still see the same thing. We call somebody in the water department we know, and we say, look, this person's bill is $700. Right now they only have $100. Yes, they got behind, but you can't shut the water off. Or they just shut the water off and they can't get an appointment for assistance until 2 months from now, but we need you to help do something. So what happens is there's all this behind the scenes stuff, nothing that's really upfront, policy based, straightforward, clear, and open to everyone. And we've spent like all this time really kind of working on these individual cases with the goal of trying to figure out how it is that we implement new policies or break down, even unknown policies that exist in the department, the way it operates, so that we can get a better understanding of what it's actually going to take to keep people's water on. So we've gone through people like at all levels. We've worked directly like with water department customer service employees. We go to the director themselves, the assistant director. We've gone to the board of commissioners, and we've get on the little public comment cards and say that we want to speak out about the rates that are happening, or we don't agree with the amount of shutoffs that are happening and they need to do something about it. We go to the elected officials. I can't tell you how many times we've gone before city council and we tell them everything that's going on, but they're also getting these same calls, from constituents. So it's not necessarily new information, but what it is we're telling them, look, now this is your responsibility to do something about it for this base of your constituency. We've gone to all of these social service providers, and that's been another part of, I think, the problem, because as more and more that the government has been kind of like outsourcing its work to nonprofits or to these newly formed organizations that say they're in the business of providing assistance to groups, to churches that now say that they're in the business of providing services not only to their members but to the public. It's gotten harder to keep track of all the different players, and then again it sort of takes the emphasis or the focus off of who the real target is, right? It's the state, or it's X corporation, or it's, particular official, because now they've sort of like delegated that work over to some group that you've now got to deal with, who's just saying, well, we're told this is the only way that you can qualify for help. It's like, well, we want to hear that. We want you to make it work. Figure it out, right? And so that just becomes another layer of the problem, even though I think that there are a lot of well-intentioned people who think that they're actually doing something to be helpful, but they're not. So we go also to, the state. At least the thing with Michigan Welfare Rights, like the history of how it is that we organize, we do the streets, the courts, and the legislature. And so, yeah, we definitely had, I can't even tell you how many, protests around it, where we go to the water department, we go before city council, we go to a march through the streets, we're in front of different churches, so lots of picketing, lots of rallies and that kind of thing. But one of the things that I think we started getting more involved with was trying to figure out how it is that we actually can be more involved in challenging or setting policy. What are those ordinances? What is that legislation that we need in order to be able to change this at a more systemic issue? Because we can keep complaining directly to these caseworkers that are at the water department, but ultimately they've got bosses, they've got elected officials, they've got people that they've got to be accountable to as well. So that's when, back in the early 2000s, we started having conversations with the folks over at Michigan Legal Services, who also introduced us over the folks at the University of Michigan Poverty Law Center. And we were saying, look, we've got to come up with our own policies around what we believe low-income-based affordability should be for water. People should not be shut off because they don't have income or because they don't have enough income to be able to keep the water on. We've got to do this in a way so that they're not spending such disproportionate amounts of their income on water bills. It's unjust for one, and it's not safe for households or for communities. So they later found this utility expert, Roger Colton, who was the one who ultimately came to Detroit, we met with, and was telling us about the work that he's doing with other communities, municipalities, to understand how it is that they can structure or restructure their billing rates, their operations, their programs, so that you can keep on your lowest income customers in a way that they can always be able to pay their bills and be contributors to the overall well-being of the system, a business model essentially. And it would also help us with what we're saying are these like human rights issues in terms of people being shut off because they can't afford. So he came up with a plan. The end of 2004 was presented to Detroit City Council, who we had been working with a few members. At the time, he had come in and interviewed people in the water department, got to understand more about how the organization is structured, and we have this proposal. It was approved by City Council, but never implemented, which has been the problem. And that's even still today the program that we keep pointing to as what it is that we're looking for in terms of a low-income-based water affordability program. 2 years later, the water department with Colton, with at the time the Department of Health and Human Services for the city of Detroit, no longer exists, but they came up with a revised version. There wasn't support from the mayor's office originally, which was also part of the problem. It was really largely city council driven. And so the mayor's office had been trying to find ways to make changes to it. One of the things that had to be part of the base of kind of filling the difference, right, between what people were paying and what the other part of the bill that was unpaid was going to be this fund that needed to be established, this $5 million fund. And the water department had found a way to come up with that, the revenue for that, through customer service savings, through late fees that would not be a challenge to this whole Lansing versus Bolt or Headley Amendment kind of constitutional challenges that we've heard. And then other donations that people could opt into on their water bills to contribute to said fund. During those years, also with a former mayor, the monies disappeared. And so the city was going through a lot of financial struggles. There were problems with the bonds, and Wall Street was coming and wanting to be paid, and the city was not paying its bills and couldn't even meet payroll, and there was a lot of crisis. And what we've said, many times again, that Detroit, it was going through the process of being bankrupted. And so there was a whole whole series of things at play. And the water department, as being one of the largest assets, was also viewed as one of the biggest prizes to be part of what could be a potential takeover, right? And we saw this. Detroit had been for many years, envied for the system, but also criticized, right? So Detroiters built the system, and as the suburbs grew and as the politics of the region changed and the economy developed into other ways, from not just necessarily having Detroit being this urban center of like automotive industry, people left the city, but they needed infrastructure, right? And so you asked the biggest player to help you. So Detroit ended up serving like over 110 cities and townships. And in those years, people are also looking at Detroit to blame for why it is that their water and sewage bills are as they are. And so, like we've said, Detroit was, for many years, has been a problem with its own record keeping and its own, information sharing about what it takes to operate plants and where the costs go and why the rates are what they are. And like many cities across the country, hadn't been dealing with the real hard issues of what do you do when a system is old and aged and the infrastructure has to be replaced, and now the big costs are coming down that people hadn't had to deal with before because you had a good system. And so a lot of these questions started emerging that started challenging whether or not Detroit should hold on to its water system itself. Instead people are like, well, we think we should have a vote. Not only that, we think we should have some control. So while those conversations are playing out, we're continuing to highlight here what are these problems with more and more people being shut off and saying, look, we got to look more closely at this because these are serious issues, and it's not okay to think that any household should be living without water, especially our most vulnerable ones. So what are we going to do about it? So we're touting this water affordability program, and we're saying, look, we need to get this implemented, and we've got all these political obstacles and hurdles that are making it so that we can't get it done. And people are saying, oh, it's not possible, right? So, but what do? We can't allow that to be the answer because we still need water to survive. And then how is it again, in Michigan, surrounded by Great Lakes, that we're having this problem? Of all places in the world, we should not be having this problem. How is it that we can't get some resolve around this? So we start looking at, okay, well, what are the options? What do we need to do politically to try and address this?